They sent her as a joke, the plain one. The daughter no man had chosen, wrapped in her mother's old dress and shame. The rancher was expecting beauty, someone to ease his loneliness and bear his name, but when the wagon stopped and she stepped down, the laughter from her kin echoed like thunder. She kept her eyes low, bracing for rejection. But the rancher didn't laugh. He saw the strength in her hands, the honesty in her gaze, the kind of beauty that doesn't fade with time. He took her hand and said, "You'll do just fine." That night, as the sun sank over the prairie, everyone realized the joke wasn't on her. It was on those who'd never known the worth of a good heart. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The ceremony took place beneath a sky so vast it made the world feel small, the kind of endless blue that swallowed sound and swallowed doubt if one stared long enough. The preacher's voice was thin against the wind, his words barely audible over the restless sigh of the prairie grass. She stood beside the rancher, her hands folded tight before her, feeling the coarse fabric of her mother's old dress chafe against her skin. The lace at the collar had yellowed with age, and a seam at her shoulder had come loose during the long ride. Her kin stood a little distance away, gathered like buzzards at a spectacle they didn't expect to last. Their smirks were soft but sharp, full of the kind of laughter that didn't need to be spoken aloud to sting. Her father didn't meet her eyes. Her mother kept dabbing at tears that weren't grief so much as embarrassment. The rancher, by contrast, looked calm, steady as the land itself, his hat in his hands, the sun carving deep lines into his face. He was not a young man, nor a particularly handsome one, but there was something solid in him, something unmoved by the world's cruelty. When the preacher asked if he'd take her, he answered without hesitation, voice low and sure, "I will." The simplicity of it startled her. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't duty. It was something quieter, something she couldn't yet name. When it was her turn to speak, her tongue felt heavy, her throat dry. The wind caught her veil, tugging it loose, and for a brief second she thought it might carry her words away. But she managed to whisper, "I will." And when she did, the rancher smiled just a flicker, but it was enough to still the trembling in her hands. The preacher closed his book, muttered a blessing, and the world went on turning. There were no rings, no grand declarations, no music to fill the silence that followed. Just the shuffle of boots in the dirt and the fading sound of her family's wagon wheels as they rolled away, taking their laughter with them. The rancher offered her his arm, awkwardly but with respect, and led her toward the small house that would now be hers too. It stood at the edge of a wide field, weathered but clean, with smoke curling faintly from the chimney and a single horse tied to the post out front. Inside, it smelled of wood, oil, and dust, and a life lived in quiet rhythm. She stood in the doorway, uncertain, her heart pounding so loud it drowned out her thoughts. "It ain't much," the rancher said softly, setting his hat on the table. "But it's honest." His voice was gentle, the drawl roughened by years of solitude. He didn't touch her, didn't try to claim what the law now said was his. Instead, he nodded toward a second plate on the table, a stew still warm from the stove. "Eat," he said. "You look near starved." She did as he asked, though her stomach twisted with nerves. Every movement felt foreign, the spoon too heavy, the room too quiet, the man too kind. When he bowed his head in prayer, she hesitated before doing the same, her fingers tracing invisible shapes on the tabletop. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint echo of her family's departure into the distance. She realized then that she was alone in every sense that mattered but not unwanted. The rancher finished his prayer and lifted his head, meeting her gaze for the first time since the vows. There was no mockery in his eyes, only something patient, almost tender. "You'll do just fine," he said again, the same words he'd spoken when she first stepped down from the wagon. But now they didn't sound like resignation. They sounded like truth. And though her heart still trembled, it was not from fear, it was from the quiet, unfamiliar feeling that maybe, just maybe, she had been chosen after all. The mornings came cold and cruel, the kind that bit at her fingers before she could light the stove, the kind that made her breath curl like ghosts in the dim kitchen air. Each dawn began the same, the soft groan of the wind against the shutters, the far-off bawl of cattle somewhere beyond the fence line, and the sound of him always awake before her moving quietly through the yard. his boots thudding steady against frozen earth. He was a man of habit, one who spoke only when words were needed, and though his silence was never sharp, it pressed down on her all the same. At first, she tried to fill it with humming as she scrubbed the floor, with talk about the weather or the stew she planned to make, but his replies came short, polite, like a man who'd spent so long alone he'd forgotten how to share his voice. Still, he was never unkind. When she burned her hand on the stove, he fetched a pail of cool water without a word. When her back ached from hauling feed, he quietly took the next sack from her arms. But those small mercies only deepened her confusion. She didn't know what to make of a man who offered help without pity, who treated her like a partner yet never crossed the invisible line between them. Each night, when she blew out the lantern and lay on her side of the bed, she'd hear him breathing steady and distant, like the ticking of an old clock she couldn't silence. In the dark, her mind wandered to the faces of her kin, their laughter the day she left, her father's smirk as he handed her off like a burden too heavy to keep. Their voices haunted her worst when she paused from work and saw her reflection in the wash basin. The plainness of her face, the roughness of her hands, the smallness of her frame beside the wide, indifferent world. She'd whisper to herself that she wasn't broken, that she had purpose here. But the truth clung to her like dust. She didn't know if she was wanted or merely tolerated. The days stretched long and lean, the sun blazing down without mercy, drying the earth and her spirit alike. Yet, in the rhythm of the work, something began to shift. She learned to mend fences, to drive nails straight, to keep the fire burning through the night without smoke clogging the flue. The rancher never praised her, but she noticed the way his eyes lingered just a moment longer on a line of clean laundry snapping in the wind or a row of repaired tools neatly set in their places. One evening, as she stood outside with her sleeves rolled, the wind whipping her hair across her face, he paused beside her, his shadow long in the dust. "You work hard," he said simply, as if the words surprised even him. She turned, startled by the sound of his voice softened by something close to respect. "So do you," she replied, though it came out quieter than she meant. For a heartbeat, their eyes met brief, uncertain, and then he tipped his hat and walked toward the barn without another word. She watched him go, feeling the ache in her shoulders and the strange warmth in her chest mingling together until she couldn't tell one from the other. The days that followed didn't get easier, but they began to make sense. There was dignity in the work, in the shared silence that no longer felt so empty. Each dawn still came cold, but by dusk, when the sky burned red and the air smelled of hay and smoke, she found herself looking for him on the horizon and realizing that, in the vast loneliness of the prairie, two quiet souls had begun to learn the language of survival together. The day she rode into town, the sun was merciless, the kind that bleached color from the earth and burned truth into every face. She had come only for flour, coffee, and a few nails, the simplest of errands, but even before her boots hit the ground, she felt the weight of eyes on her. The general store was small, crowded with the smell of leather and dust, the kind of place where gossip clung thicker than the flies. She stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling bright and cruel, and silence followed her in like a shadow. Two women by the shelves turned, their chatter faltering mid-laugh. One leaned close to the other, murmuring low, but not low enough. "That's her, the one he married." The other snorted, hiding her smirk behind her gloved hand. "Lord, she looks even plainer than they said." Their words struck with a sting sharper than a slap, but she didn't flinch. She only nodded to the shopkeeper, keeping her gaze fixed on the counter as she handed him her list. Still, the whispers spread like wildfire through dry grass, men at the doorway muttering about the rancher's poor luck, women pitying him with false sweetness, and someone behind her chuckling, "Guess he settled for what no one else would." Her hands shook as she gathered her parcels, but her voice when she spoke to the shopkeeper was steady. "Put it on Mr. Avery's account," she said, her tone polite, almost proud. Outside, the heat pressed against her like judgment itself. She loaded the supplies into the wagon with trembling fingers, every breath tight with the effort not to cry. The street was quiet save for the thud of hooves and the creak of the harness. She could feel the eyes still following her, and for the first time since leaving her family's house, she wondered if they had been right, if this life she was building was nothing more than a cruel joke that everyone but her understood. When she turned to climb onto the seat, a shadow moved across the ground. The rancher was there, standing beside the wagon, his eyes dark beneath the brim of his hat. She hadn't seen him ride into town. But somehow he was just there, like the earth itself had sent him. For a long moment, he said nothing, just looked at her with that quiet, unreadable gaze. The people nearby pretended not to stare, though every one of them was watching. "You done?" he asked finally. His voice was even, but there was a weight beneath it, a steadiness that anchored her shaking heart. She nodded, brushing the dust from her skirt. "Yes," she managed, her throat dry. He reached up, took the reins from her hands, and climbed onto the wagon beside her. The crowd shifted, restless, uncertain. He didn't speak again, just looked down the street where the whispers still hummed like flies over spoiled fruit. Then, before snapping the reins, he turned to her and said quietly, "Don't listen to 'em. They don't know a damn thing worth hearing." It wasn't much, but it was enough. His words, plain and few, cut through the noise cleaner than any defense could have. As the wagon rolled out of town, she stared ahead, her jaw set, her heart pounding with something fierce and unfamiliar. The wind caught her hair, lifting it from her face, and for the first time she didn't lower her eyes. The laughter behind them faded, swallowed by the distance and the hum of the wheels. When they reached open land again, he glanced her way, just once, and she caught at the faintest hint of pride in his eyes. She didn't thank him, and he didn't expect her to. But as the ranch came into view, she realized something had shifted. The cruelty of the town had burned away the last trace of her shame, and in its place, something stronger was beginning to take root, a quiet kind of dignity that no gossip could ever touch. The sun had barely slipped beneath the horizon when she heard it, the sharp, panicked cry of something alive and hurting, slicing through the stillness of the ranch like a blade through cloth. She set down the pail she was carrying and followed the sound across the field, the dry grass whispering against her skirts as she ran. The air was cooling fast, the sky streaked pink and gold, and in the far pasture, tangled near a sagging stretch of fence, she found the colt. Its flanks heaved with fear, sweat and blood mixing in the fading light as it kicked helplessly against the barbed wire coiled around its leg. The sight stopped her cold for only a breath, but instinct overrode fear. Without thinking, she dropped to her knees in the dirt, murmuring soft, steady words she didn't know she remembered how to say. "Easy now. Easy." Her hands moved quickly, careful not to startle the creature more than it already was. The colt's eyes rolled white, its nostrils flaring, the pain in its movements so raw it made her heart ache. She worked the hem of her skirt beneath the wire, using it to shield the flesh as she pried the barbs away one by one. Each cut came with a sting to her fingers, but she didn't stop. The more it bled, the gentler she became, whispering nonsense just to keep the sound of her voice steady in the twilight. Behind her, she didn't hear the soft tread of boots approaching, didn't notice the faint scrape of metal as the rancher climbed through the gate. He stopped a few paces away, arms crossed, saying nothing. The dying light fell across her hair, and he saw the tremor in her shoulders, not from weakness, but from effort, from care so fierce it bordered on defiance. She was small against the wide world, yet somehow she filled it. When she finally freed the colt's leg, it stumbled, trembling, and nearly fell into her. She caught it, pressing her hands against its neck, whispering again until it stilled. Blood streaked her palms, and her skirt was torn where the wire had caught it, but her face held a calm he'd never seen in anyone before. Slowly, she tore a strip of cloth from her sleeve, wrapping it tight around the wound. The colt nickered softly, its breathing easing as it leaned into her touch. Only then did she look up and see him standing there. For a moment, neither spoke. The breeze carried the scent of dust and iron, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers crushed beneath her knees. "You'll scare him," she said quietly, not unkindly, as if he were another skittish thing she was tending. He blinked, then crouched beside her, his movements careful, deliberate. Together they eased the colt to its feet, guiding it toward the barn where the lantern light spilled warm and golden from the open door. Inside, they led it to a stall, and she fetched clean water while he held the reins. The silence between them was different now, softer, alive with unspoken things. When she finished cleaning the wound, he finally spoke. "Didn't think you'd be strong enough to do all that," he said, voice low but not mocking. She met his gaze, Steady. Strength's just patience that don't quit, she replied. He looked at her for a long time, then really looked, past the plain dress and the tired eyes, to the steady fire beneath it all. Something in his chest shifted. A realization that crept in as quietly as dusk. She was not the burden others had claimed. Not the consolation prize fate had handed him. She was a force gentle, yes, but forged from iron all the same. As the colt settled into sleep, he found himself wanting to thank her, to tell her what he saw. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached for her torn sleeve, holding it out to her with an awkward half-smile. "You'll catch cold," he murmured. She took it, their fingers brushing, and for the first time since they'd met, she didn't look away. In the barn's quiet glow, surrounded by the smell of hay and life, something unspoken took root between them, something that didn't need laughter or beauty to be true. The night settled over the ranch with the hush of an old prayer, the kind whispered by those too tired to believe but too stubborn to stop. The air was cool, carrying the scent of hay and rain from the far hills, and the only sound inside the house was the faint creak of floorboards as she moved about, wiping her hands on her apron after finishing the evening chores. The colt was resting in the barn, alive and breathing easy thanks to her care, but her own body ached with exhaustion. She poured a little water into the basin, washing the blood and dust from her palms, wincing when the cuts from the barbed wire stung. Behind her, the door opened with its familiar groan. She didn't turn at first, thinking he'd come in the way he always did, quietly, filling the room without speaking. But tonight the air felt different, heavier somehow, as if carrying something long overdue. He stood by the threshold, hat in hand, his broad shoulders outlined by moonlight. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in that rough, gravelly voice that had always held more silence than sound, he said, "You did good today." The words were simple, but they struck her like music, unexpected, fragile, and precious. She looked up, startled, unsure she'd heard right. He nodded toward the window, where the barn lantern still flickered faintly. "That colt would have died if you hadn't been there," he went on, his tone unpolished but sincere. "You got a steady way about you. Didn't think much of it at first, but I was wrong." The last words came slow, almost reluctant, as if they'd been trapped behind his ribs for years. She turned toward him fully now, her heart thrumming like a bird's wings. He shifted under her gaze, awkward as a man unaccustomed to being seen. "It weren't nothin'," she said softly, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "Any soul would have done the same." "No," he said, shaking his head. "Most would have turned away. You didn't." His voice dipped low, warm enough to chase the chill from the room. He rubbed the back of his neck, searching for words that didn't come easy. "Just wanted to say thank you." And there it was, the breaking of silence, the first bridge between two lonely hearts built not from grand promises or polished charm, but from plain, honest gratitude. She felt her chest tighten with something she couldn't quite name, a mix of relief and longing and the strange, dizzying joy of being seen as she truly was. The lamp on the table flickered, casting soft light over his face, and she saw the tired kindness in his eyes, the kind that comes not from pity, but from respect. For the first time since she'd stepped off that wagon, she didn't feel small. She smiled then, shy but unguarded. The kind of smile that comes from somewhere deep, from a part of her that had forgotten how. He caught it, and his breath seemed to hitch just slightly, though he said nothing more. Instead, he tipped his hat, murmured a quiet good night, and turned toward his room. She watched him go, her pulse still racing, her smile lingering even after the door clicked shut. The house felt different now, warmer, as if his few words had lit a fire neither of them could see but both could feel. She looked down at her hands, still raw and rough, and whispered to herself, "You did good today," repeating his words like a prayer. Outside, the wind eased, the stars burned steady, and for the first time since her wedding day, she didn't feel like someone's burden or mistake. She felt like a woman beginning to belong to the land, to the house, and maybe, just maybe, to him. The letter came on a windless afternoon, delivered by the post rider who tipped his hat and rode on without a word, leaving behind a cloud of dust that hung in the air like judgment. She stood on the porch, the paper trembling in her hands, her name written in her sister's looping scrawl, too neat, too sweet, hiding venom between every curve of ink. The rancher was out mending a fence near the north pasture, his figure small against the endless sweep of the horizon, so there was no one to see her hesitate before she broke the wax seal. The words inside were sharp and mocking, each sentence dripping with pity disguised as kindness. Pa says you're still alive out there. We heard you're working the fields now. Guess that makes you the ranch hand's wife. Maybe that suits you better than Lace and Company. Some women were born to serve, I suppose. Her vision blurred as she read, but not from tears. There were none left to shed for people who had never once seen her worth. The rest of the letter went on in the same cruel rhythm, painting her life as something small, something pitiful, while praising themselves for moving on. She folded it carefully, set it on the porch rail, and stared out across the golden sweep of the pasture, the wind teasing at the hem of her dress. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she struck a match. The flame caught fast, curling the edges inward until the words turned to ash. The smoke rose thin and steady, carrying their scorn into the endless Texas sky where it vanished without a trace. She watched until the last ember died, then brushed the ashes from the wood and turned back to the field. There was work to do, fences to mend, feed to haul, and a life to keep building with her own 2 hands. Each movement felt deliberate, purposeful, a quiet defiance against every name they'd ever called her. When the rancher came back at dusk, sweat streaking the dust on his brow, he found her hauling hay bales to the barn, her arms taut with effort but her posture proud, unbroken. He didn't ask what had happened. The faint trace of smoke on the wind told him enough. He stood there a moment, watching her work with a focus that seemed to draw strength from the land itself. She didn't see him at first, too lost in the rhythm of her labor, the lift, the breath, the set down, over and over until the ache in her muscles turned into something steady, something alive. When she finally looked up, her hair had come loose, and the last light of the sun caught her face, softening the lines that hardship had etched there. He felt something stir in his chest then, something he hadn't let himself feel since before loneliness became his only companion. Admiration, fierce and unshakable. "You been at it all day?" he asked as he stepped closer, his voice careful, as though afraid to break the spell of her quiet strength. She wiped her hands on her skirt and nodded. "Work don't stop just 'cause someone wants to laugh," she said simply. The words held no bitterness, only truth. He nodded slowly, eyes narrowing with respect. "No," he said. "Guess it don't." For a while they stood there side by side in the lengthening shadows, saying nothing more. The wind stirred again, carrying away the scent of burnt paper and replacing it with that of grass and earth and new beginnings. That night, as the stars rose above the ranch and the air cooled, he lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of her breath in the next room. She had weathered cruelty, isolation, and doubt, and each time she'd come out stronger, steadier, like the land itself. And for the first time, he realized she didn't just belong to the ranch. The ranch had come to belong to her. The wind had been restless all afternoon, a low hum rolling across the plains, carrying the scent of dust and warning. By sundown, the sky had turned the color of bruised copper, and thunder grumbled somewhere far off, a storm with no promise of rain. The rancher stood on the porch, scanning the horizon, his gut heavy with unease. He'd lived long enough to know that kind of sky didn't bring water. It brought fire. When the first strike came, it split the dark clean in 2, and moments later he saw thin tendrils of smoke rising from the dry grass near the lower field. Then came the second strike, closer this time, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The horses were down there, penned near the creek bed, their only escape cut off by the rising flames. He turned toward the barn, shouting her name, but she was already gone. He saw her in the distance, riding hard through the heat-hazed air, skirts whipping around her legs, her figure small but unyielding against the vast, burning plain. Panic tore through him as he saddled his own horse, the smell of smoke thick now, choking the wind. By the time he reached the lower field, the fire had turned the horizon into a wall of living flame. Sparks leapt through the air like fireflies, and the roar of it drowned out every sound but his own heartbeat. Through the smoke, he caught sight of her half-hidden, wild-eyed, swinging the gate open with one arm while waving her coat with the other, driving the terrified horses toward safety. The blaze burned close enough to light her hair like gold, and he could hear her coughing. But still she stood her ground, refusing to move until the last horse had fled. He shouted her name again, voice cracking from the heat, but she didn't turn. It wasn't until the flames closed around her that she finally stumbled back, her strength breaking just as he reached her. He dismounted before the horse had even stopped moving, grabbing her by the waist and dragging her clear of the smoke. Together they fell hard into the dirt, gasping, the world a chaos of heat and ash. He pulled her close, wrapping his body over hers as the fire raged past, its breath searing the air. For what felt like hours, they stayed there, clinging to life in the narrow strip of earth the flames had spared. Then, slowly, the wind shifted. Rain came not much, just enough to tame the fire's hunger, and the roar began to fade into crackling embers. The land steamed, blackened and broken, but alive. He lifted his head first, coughing hard, his throat raw and dry. She lay still beside him, her face streaked with soot, her hair plastered to her skin. "Hey," he rasped, his hand trembling as he touched her shoulder. "Hey, look at me." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharp with recognition. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse breath escaped. "You damn fool," he whispered, though his voice broke halfway through. Could have burned with the rest of it. She managed a faint, crooked smile. "Would have been worse," she murmured, leaving them behind. That simple truth undid him more than any wound could. He cupped her face in his hands, thumb brushing away soot that smeared instead of vanished, his fear twisting into something deeper, something he'd never let himself feel before. It was raw, wordless, heavy as the smoke still hanging in the air. He wanted to tell her she was brave, that she was the heart of this place, that he couldn't bear the thought of losing her. But the words stuck, caught somewhere between gratitude and love, too fragile to speak aloud. So instead, he held her there in the ash and ruin until the stars reappeared overhead, pale and trembling, their faint light reflecting in her tired eyes. When she finally leaned against him, her head resting on his chest, he exhaled for the first time since the fire began. The night was quiet again, save for the soft hiss of dying flames and the steady rhythm of two hearts still beating, proof that even in the blackened fields of loss, something fierce and beautiful had survived. The house was heavy with the scent of smoke and liniment, the kind of smell that lingers in the walls long after the fire's gone out. She sat at the kitchen table, her arms bare and blistered, the lamplight throwing soft gold across her face. Her hair, still damp from washing away soot, clung to her neck in dark curls. The silence between them was thick but not uneasy, more like the quiet that follows a storm, when the world pauses to breathe again. He moved about the room slowly, his hands steady despite the tremor he felt inside, gathering clean bandages and a tin of salve. Each movement was deliberate, careful, as though handling something sacred. She watched him from beneath her lashes, her expression unreadable but calm. When he sat down beside her, she flinched a little as the cool salve touched her skin, but she didn't pull away. His rough fingers worked gently over her burns, the same hands that could bend iron now softened by something he didn't yet know how to name. Outside, the wind whispered through the charred fields, carrying the faint scent of rain and ash. For a long time, neither spoke, their silence saying more than words could. Finally, he exhaled, long and low, and set the bandages aside. "You shouldn't have gone out there," he said quietly. "Could have died." She smiled faintly, the corner of her mouth twitching despite the pain. "So could you." He looked at her then, really looked at the curve of her cheekbone, the way the light caught her eyes, the steadiness that never once faltered even when the world around her did. There was no fear in her, only the calm of someone who had already faced the worst life could offer and chosen to keep standing. "You're stubborn as they come," he muttered, but the words carried no anger, only awe. She laughed softly, a sound like the first breath after drowning. "Guess I had to be." He nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands, hands that had spent years building fences, burying regret, waiting for something he couldn't define. When he spoke again, his voice was rough, but not from the smoke. "I used to think I knew what I wanted," he said, his tone almost distant. "When I was younger, I thought beauty was the thing worth chasing. Pretty face, sweet words, soft hands. I learned different." He paused, the lamplight catching the exhaustion in his eyes. "Beauty fades, sooner or later, It always does. But courage, real courage, sticks. It stays when everything else burns away. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right, her breath catching in the stillness. He looked up then, meeting her eyes squarely, and in that gaze she saw no distance left, no guarded walls, only truth laid bare. "You're everything I ever needed," he said softly. The words came without hesitation, simple and unadorned, but they filled the room like light. For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. All the years of doubt, of being overlooked, dismissed, traded like something worthless, they shattered in that moment, falling away like ash in the wind. She wanted to answer, to say something that matched the weight of his confession, but nothing came. Instead, she reached out, her burned fingers trembling as they brushed the back of his hand. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just turned his palm upward and closed his fingers gently around hers, holding on as if afraid she might vanish. The air between them changed, then no longer heavy with what hadn't been said, but alive with everything that finally had. The lamp flickered once, casting their shadows together on the wall. Outside, the night hummed low and endless, and in the quiet heart of that small, soot-stained kitchen, two souls who had spent their lives mistaking survival for solitude finally found what both had been missing. Not beauty, not perfection, but a love strong enough to stand in the fire and come out alive. The day her family came was bright and windless, the kind of morning that made the land look endless. Every blade of grass lit like gold under the Texas Sunday. She was hanging laundry by the porch when she saw the wagon cresting the far hill, paint chipped, horses weary, and faces she hadn't seen since the day they'd sent her off like unwanted cargo. Her stomach tightened, but her hands didn't falter. She pinned the last shirt to the line, the cloth snapping crisp in the breeze, before wiping her palms on her apron and stepping forward. The ranch looked nothing like it had then. The fences stood straight, the barn doors freshly painted, the fields thick with green after the spring rains. Smoke curled lazy and content from the chimney, carrying the scent of bread she'd baked that morning. When the wagon rolled into the yard, her father climbed down first, his once proud shoulders slumped by time and debt. Her mother followed, eyes darting across the house, as though searching for proof of misery. Her sister came last, still pretty and cruel, the same smirk playing at her lips that had sent her away all those months ago. "Well," her sister drawled, "look at you." She smiled, slow and steady. "I am," she said simply, and her voice carried the calm weight of a woman who owed no explanation. The rancher stepped out from the barn just then, wiping his hands on a rag. He was sun-browned and solid, the quiet in him no longer emptiness but strength. He crossed the yard, nodded politely to her kin, and stood beside her without needing to speak. His presence alone drew a line they couldn't cross. "We thought we'd check on you," her father said, his tone uneasy. "Figured you might be wantin' to come home." "I am home," she answered. The words fell like stones into still water, no anger, no plea, just truth. Her mother's face pinched. "You look different," she said. "Harder." She tilted her head, the faintest smile curving her lips. "No, just stronger." The rancher placed a hand lightly at her back, steady, grounding, and she felt the warmth of it through the fabric, not as possession, but as partnership. Her family's eyes flicked between them, reading what words couldn't say. A bond built not on chance or charity, but on respect, forged in fire and tempered by work. Her sister's smirk faltered first. "Guess you made something of yourself after all," she said, but there was a bitter edge in her tone. "Guess I did," she replied, her smile widening. "Didn't have to tear anyone else down to do it." "Neither." The rancher let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but said nothing. Instead, he turned toward her father. "You'll stay for supper?" he asked. The older man hesitated, his pride warring with the smell of bread and the unspoken truth that the daughter he'd pitied had built more with her bare hands than he'd ever managed. "If you're askin'," he said gruffly. "I'm askin'," the rancher replied. Inside, the table was set simple but full: meat, beans, bread, and the kind of silence that carried no shame. Her family ate quietly, glancing around at the life they had once laughed at. When her mother finally spoke, her voice was soft. "He treats you well," she said. She met her gaze and nodded. "Better than I thought I deserved." Her mother's eyes shimmered, but she looked away. When the meal was done and the wagon rolled out again, the air felt lighter. They waved once before vanishing down the dusty road, but she didn't watch them go. Instead, she turned to the rancher, brushing the hair from her face as the wind shifted. "You didn't have to be so kind," she said. He smiled faintly. "Didn't do it for them." She looked at him then, sunlight catching in her eyes, and saw all the things they'd built, not just a ranch, but a home. The laughter of her family no longer echoed in her mind. What lingered instead was the quiet strength between her and the man beside her, the unspoken promise that she would never again be anyone's joke. As the sun sank low and the air filled with the hum of crickets, she realized the world had finally turned in her favor, not by chance, but by courage. The sun dipped low over the horizon, bleeding amber, and rose across the sky, the kind of light that made even the harsh land look gentle. The air was still warm from the day, but the wind that rose carried the scent of sage and dust, the smell of home. She rode beside him, her posture easy, her hat tilted just enough to shade her eyes from the fading light. The horses moved in rhythm, their hooves thudding softly against the earth, as if they too understood the peace that had finally settled over the ranch. The fields stretched wide behind them, golden with the promise of harvest, and ahead lay miles of open prairie, the same wild expanse that had once felt like exile but now felt like freedom. She glanced sideways at him, his face half-shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, his jaw rough with a day's work, his eyes softer than she ever thought a man's could be. Months ago, this ride would have been silent, both of them bound by caution and pride. But now, words weren't needed. Everything that mattered was already understood. He reined in slightly, slowing to ride beside her close enough that their boots brushed. The light caught her face then, and he turned toward her with a look she'd never forget. "You know," he said quietly, his voice carrying over the wind, "they sent me a joke." She blinked, startled for a heartbeat, then smiled faintly, remembering the cruel laughter that had followed her out of town all those months ago, the humiliation, the shame, the way she'd ridden toward a stranger in a fate no one thought she deserved. But before she could answer, he went on, his tone soft and sure. "But I got a miracle." The words hung between them, pure and unadorned, and for the first time she didn't try to hide the emotion that welled in her chest. The wind caught her hair, tugging it free from its braid, scattering it across her shoulders like strands of sunlight. She looked ahead, eyes glistening, and let out a long, trembling breath that turned into laughter light, unrestrained, the sound of someone who had finally found peace. "You sure about that?" she teased, her voice steady now, touched with that quiet confidence he'd come to love. "Miracles don't usually haul hay or chase cattle." He chuckled, low and deep. "Then maybe God's got a sense of humor." She smiled wider, shaking her head, but in her heart she knew he meant every word. Because this land, this life, had remade them both. The woman who had once arrived in borrowed clothes, afraid to speak above a whisper, now rode with her head high, the sun glinting off the edge of her smile. The man who had once thought himself beyond feeling, content to let the world pass in silence, now carried warmth in his voice and gentleness in his hands. They had found in each other what neither had known they needed, not perfection, not beauty, but understanding. As they reached the crest of the ridge, the world opened wide before them, the ranch spread out like a promise kept. He reached over, his rough hand brushing hers, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breath. She met his gaze, and in it saw everything that had been built from pain, something stronger than love. Perhaps respect, devotion, and a shared endurance that would outlast them both. The sky deepened into crimson and gold, the horizon swallowing the Sunday. The wind shifted again, cool now, whispering through the grass as if the earth itself was telling their story. And as they rode side by side into that endless dusk, her heart swelled with a quiet truth. She was no longer the ugly daughter, the unwanted one. She was the woman who'd tamed loneliness with kindness, turned ridicule into grace, and proven that in a land as unforgiving as the West, beauty wasn't something you were born with, it was something you earned, one act of courage at a time.